You're on.
Okay. Well, it's kind of an emotional roller coaster for some of us, some more than others, but we started the discussion tonight with all trusting in the Lord. Tonight's lesson is going to conclude the first part of, I guess, the first division or of our outline of the book of Leviticus, and that is the 5 offerings that God provided to his people. And these offerings were all part of the covenant relationship between God, who is holy, and the people that he chose to be his own, who frankly were just like us, they're very holy. And what God did is he provided these offerings as a means to allow unholy, impure, sinful people to approach God and to have a relationship with God and to teach these people what holiness is all about. And so in these offerings, we talked about the free will offerings, and then we talked about the um, offerings for um, the offerings for purification, and we're down to the final, the 5th offering that God provided to his people, and that's the reparation offerings. And so we're going to follow the same format that we have in previous classes. We're going to have the study and then discussion questions that are going to bring out or emphasize points. One thing different about tonight's lesson is that I'm going to this is a lesson about forgiveness. And built into the reparation or guilt offerings is this concept of forgiveness. And what we're going to see from the Old Testament is what Jesus says about forgiveness and how forgiveness operates. And we're going to go to a parable that Jesus disciples. And as we have learned and studied in the past, almost all, in fact, I can't think of a parable that isn't about salvation, but it also is parables that talk about after salvation or justification, the process of sanctification or becoming more Christ-like. We're going to talk about the parable of the unmerciful servant and how it relates to the doctrine or the principle of forgiveness that we're going to introduce this lesson with. Now, last week we learned that the purification or sin offerings focused on sins which were committed either unknowingly or unintentionally, but these sins rendered impure the tabernacle, or defiled the Lord's holy name, or defiled the whole community or individual members of the community. And they were provided by God to reconcile God to God by establishing a series of purification offerings which symbolically cleansed the priest or the entire community or the leaders, the individual members of the community who committed these types of sins that required purification. Um, these were separated, if you recall from this week, into 2 groups. One group was the offerings required for sins by the high priest himself or by the whole congregation of Israel. If the high priest did something that uh, was in error, either unknowingly or unintentionally, with respect to the manner in which he did priestly services, or if the entire community did something that was defiling or disobedient to God. And the example that I think is the most outstanding of a community sin would be when unwittingly Israel entered into a treaty with the Gibeonites when God commanded them to destroy them. They entered into this treaty because they were tricked. They didn't intentionally defy God's word, but they believed that they were part of God's people or attached to, and that they should enter a treaty with them. And that was disobedient to God and defied God's holy name. That was an example of a sin of the whole community. With that first group, the sins and the purification sin offerings required the high priest himself to cleanse the tabernacle itself. And he did so by taking a bull and slaughtering it and taking the blood bull to the inside of the tabernacle where he purified the most holy place with sprinkling blood 7 times in front of the veil. And then he cleansed the rest of the tabernacle on the inside by putting blood on the horns of the golden altar of incense. And then he would go outside the temple, having purified the temple or the tabernacle, and then he would pour the rest of the blood around the altar. Um, it also required the high priest to take only the fatty portions of the bull and put those on the burnt offering, and then he'd take the rest of the bull to about a place 2 miles outside the Israeli camp, where the entire bull, the skin, and everything was outside the camp. Those were the offerings for purification made for the priest himself and for the whole community. Now, when individual members of the community or leaders of the community committed sins that required a purification offering, if we recall, they required the leader to offer an unblemished male goat or ram. It required a member of the community to offer either a female goat or sheep. And if they couldn't afford that, they could offer 2 birds, 2 turtle doves, or 2 pigeons. And if they couldn't offer that, they could offer a grain offering. And all of this was dependent on health because God wanted this purification offering to be available to everybody. Um, the blood sacrifice of the animal was sprinkled by a priest on the horns of the burnt altar outside the tabernacle. No requirement was for the high priest to go in and cleanse the tabernacle itself. The rest of the blood was poured out around the brazen altar. The fatty portions of the slaughtered animal or the bird, or that portion of the grain offering without oil, frankincense, that was burned on the altar, and the remainder was given to the priest. So the priest would have an offering of food from the sacrifice. These purifications offerings designed by God to teach his chosen people that they were held responsible for their sin, whether intentional or not intentional, they're knowingly or unknowingly. Um, these sins, if they were not acknowledged, they created a problem of dishonoring God. And they use the word defilement throughout these purification offerings because these purification offerings were an offer in atonement, but also an offer in purification. Now, this week, we're going to look at the guilt offerings. This is offerings which God required when individual members of the Israelite community committed sins which violated their covenant relationship with or loyalty to God and which demonstrated their unfaithfulness to God. This is something that didn't create an impurity, but it violated the covenant relationship between God and his people. They are sins of disobedience, if you will, or lack of loyalty. Um, these sins, whether inadvertently or unknowingly committed by the sinner, were considered as sins against God himself, even though the sin may have involved a trespass to property or defrauding other members of the community with respect to their property interests. Except in the cases where the sin itself was unknown to the trespasser, but it still profaned a holy item that belonged to God. Guilt offering required the sinner who was defrauded, the priest or defrauded another member of the community, to make restitution. So built into the guilt offering is restitution, with the exception of sins that the perpetrator did not know about. And it also required them to confess their sin. And another common theme with respect to all of these guilt offerings is that after making restitution and confessing their sin and offering a ram in atonement, the sinner received from the priest forgiveness. And that forgiveness was binding, just like a court of law if we declare somebody not guilty after a jury trial. For the purposes of the law and purposes of the relationship with God, with the relationship with other in the community, whoever was forgiven by the priest on behalf of the whole community. So this week's lesson is about the offerings of reconciliation and forgiveness established by God in order to maintain and restore the Old Testament covenant relationship between God and Israel as his chosen people. But it also points to the reconciliation and forgiveness which God in his mercy bestows upon the repentant believer. So the main message that I want you to take from tonight's lesson is that the reparation offerings allowed the sinner to make restitution and offer a sacrifice of atonement to receive forgiveness for sins which defiled God's holiness or defrauded God's people, pointing towards the merciful forgiveness which a repentant believer receives from God under the new covenant. The outline that we're going to discuss is an overview of these reparation or guilt offerings, what they all have in common. Then we're going to go into details about the inadvertent or unknowing sins, which profaned or misused items set up God. Then we're going to talk about sins which defrauded God and others. And then we're going to talk about the parable of the unmerciful servant and see how forgiveness and this concept of forgiveness applies in the New Testament. We'll conclude with discussion, questions, and conclusions and applications. Well, let's talk about, I've already alluded to or summarized some of the aspects of the guilt offerings, but the terms that are used for these type of offerings change based upon the translation of the Bible. Some translations refer to the offering as a guilt offering, which emphasizes the guilt felt by the sinner for having betrayed his covenant loyalty to God. God gave man a conscience, and that conscience would recognize wrongdoing or a violation of a covenant relationship, and that guilt would cause the person to go to the tent of the meeting and offer a ram in sacrifice. Other scriptures or translations refer to the offering as a reparation offering. This emphasizes the requirement for the sinner to make restitution and pay a penalty. Others refer to the offering as a trespass offering, which emphasizes the misuse or misappropriation or trespass against property belonging to God or belonging to other members of the community. So these translations, when you put them all together, you really get the concept of what this offering is about. It's about guilt manifested in the conscience of a person who realizes that he had done something wrong, or restitution for somebody who has caused harm to God or to the other members of the community by defrauding or misusing property, and trespass when there's a violation of a property interest belonging to God or another member. So guilt, reparation, or trespass. They all emphasize different aspects of this offering. Reparation or guilt or trespass offerings were required for breaches of the covenant relationship between God and his chosen people. When we talk about the sins which required a member of the Israelite community to make a reparation or guilt offering involved offenses where the individual, as I said before, betrayed his covenant loyalty with God by knowingly or unknowingly defiling what belonged to God, or by defrauding another member or members of the Israelite community. These trespasses either disrespected God by treating an item which has been set apart for God as a common everyday item. They didn't treat it as a holy. It'd be like drinking out of a vessel of the tabernacle and using it for just a quick drink in the field because you're thirsty. It also involves committing a trespass to property belonging to another member. This is where we get into the embezzlement, the theft, and all these type of things. Items that are set apart for God are holy, and property which belonged to another member of the community, even though they had ownership interests, were treated as property that belonged to God. In other words, in the Israelite community back at the time, they treated what they owned as property that they were allowed to have and use, but it came from a blessing of God, and it was really God's property. And that's a concept that we have lost in our culture in the United States where we have private property and we think that we own our home. Well, who owns our home when we die? We don't. And so our concepts of property ownership, the reasons that the Indians were able to sell the island of Manhattan for just a few beads that didn't even represent the value of Manhattan was is because they were laughing at the white people thinking that they could own a part of the earth because they thought that was impossible for a man that only lived for so many years to own a portion of the earth. And so they thought they were taking advantage of the settlers. And it's a concept that we've lost sight of. Now, another concept that's behind this is any misuse, misappropriation, or wrongful taking of property, which was considered as belonging to God, was considered to be a breach of the covenant relationship with God. If you abuse another member of the community's property rights, you're abusing God. It's a break of your covenant relationship. God has always had a vertical covenant relationship that required horizontal action on the believers. And so if you had a covenant with God, that covenant was realized in how it was exercised horizontally to other members of the community. And the reverse is true. If horizontally you took somebody else's property, that turned out to be a vertical violation of God's covenant. So all of these verses relating to the reparation offerings describe the offending party as being unfaithful to the covenant relationship between himself and God. And this through relationship is translated in the sense of abandoning the Lord's law, turning away from or rebelling against God himself. It's considered as serious as an adultery committed by a person that's married. It's that kind of breach of loyalty or faith in a covenant relationship. So, as I mentioned, a trespass against property is a sin against God. Now, let's talk about the reparation. I say guilt. There should be a T there. Offerings consist of 4 different components. In other words, these reparation offerings all have the same 4 components in common. The first is the requirement to pay restitution. There's only one exception to that, and that's when the sin was unknown to the person that misused an item set apart to God. Except for that one type of sin, all the other offerings required restitution to be made to the offended party. If the trespass was to the priest, because let's say that you offered a sacrifice and you withheld a portion of the sacrifice from the priest, well, you have defrauded the priest. You have breached, you've caused a harm to the priest. Or if you're making a flour offering and it wasn't your best flour, um, we had a situation in Nevada. The reason that Nevada isn't the state that is known for the potatoes, it could have been instead of Idaho potatoes, it could have been Nevada potatoes, is because they got greedy and they took gunny sacks of potatoes and they'd put a rotten potatoes in the middle and then fresh potatoes on the outside. Well, you know what happens when there's one rotten potato in a sack? They all get contaminated. And that ruined the potato industry in Nevada. Well, this is the kind of thing that you could do with an offering of grain or with something else that you offer to the Lord. And then in those cases, it was you misused or you violated the covenant in what was offered or set apart to God, and the restitution was made to the priest. When the offense was to another member of the community, you stole his property, or you embezzled his property, or you had possession of the property and you destroyed it for some reason, or you lied about it. The restitution was made to the person that was offended. Now, in cases of restitution, it was the item of property was either replaced or returned, and 20% was added to it. And so in many cases, the 20% would be represented by a monetary shekel, but in most cases, it was the property itself. If I offered an impure grain offering, and because it was impure, I'd have to replace it with a new grain offering increased by 20%. If I took somebody's property, if I and I refused to return it, or I violated this sin with the property by a theft or embezzlement, I'd have to restore that item of property to the person I took it from. Plus, I would have to add 20% of its value to that property. And so this was all measured by a shekel value. And if you, I tried to simplify this without getting into how that was calculated, but the concept of restitution is that you paid back the item that you defiled or you profaned, and plus 20%. Now, this restitution was required before the atonement offering was made. So the first component is restitution. The second component was that you were required to sacrifice a ram. No other animal was acceptable as a sacrifice for a guilt or a reparations offering. Why a ram? A ram or an adult sheep is considered to be one of the most valuable of the livestocks that were common to the people. And so it was more costly. That's to reflect the seriousness of the violation of the covenant relationship with God. The sacrifice of a ram represented payment of a penalty in reparation for the guilt from breaching the covenant. And so what we have here is not only do you have restitution, but you have atonement sacrifice in the form of a penalty paid in order to obtain significance, a ransom, if you will. Now, instead of placing the sacrificed animal's blood on the horns of the altar, which was required for a purification offering, which cleansed the altar, the blood of the ram for the reparation offering was thrown around the base of the brazen altar. And that symbolized the ransom paid for the atonement. The next requirement that all of these reparation or trespass offerings had in common is that the trespasser was required to confess his trespass. So where he knew, he had to confess. I stole my neighbor's sheep. I stole I was supposed to return my neighbor's cow and I failed to return it. Or I borrowed something and I never returned it. Or instead of stealing it, I went out there and I found something that I knew belonged to my neighbor, failed to give it back to the neighbor. So drank out of a holy vessel that and then the very result or the end result of these knowing sins which profaned or misused items set apart to God. In Leviticus 5:14 through 16,
it keeps freezing up, Tara.
the scriptures say, and the Lord bring to the Lord
Every other word, it's freezing.
as a penalty, according to the sanctuary shekel. It is a guilt offering. He must make restitution for what he has failed to do in regard to the holy things. Add a fifth of the value and give it all to the priest, who will make atonement for him with the ram as a guilt offering, and he will be forgiven. So we already talked about anything set aside to the Lord, whether it's to be used in the tabernacle or otherwise. It's considered, once you set it aside to the Lord, then it's holy. And if you misuse it in any way, then what you have to do is make this sacrifice in atonement and restitution. Now, the principle behind this sin is showing respect to the Lord required the Israelites to be careful with respect to how they handled property which they set aside to God. In his Testament teachings, Paul admonishes believers to consider their bodies as holy temples, set apart and belonging to the Lord, and as living sacrifice for worship. He also considered the church as belonging to God, exhorting his believers not to engage in any act which defiled the body of the church or the body of a believer, or which harmed either one. So you can see how this is in the Old Testament. It's kind of hard to understand. Well, how do I defile a grain offering, or how I defile a vessel set apart, or something set apart? But in the New Testament, our bodies are a holy temple. Our church is God's church. And if we harm our bodies or church, or defile our bodies or church, we have committed what they would have called in the Old Testament a sin that misuses the body or something set apart to God. Um, how often do we unintentionally harm our own bodies or hurt the church? We may think in good faith that we're trying to do something that would help the church, but we end up criticizing the leadership of the church, or we do something with our body. We don't nourish it properly. We don't, we abuse it sometimes with alcohol or other behaviors. We, there's a lot of things that we do, and we're not saying I am purposely or intentionally trying to misuse something holy set apart to God. But if you take the Old Testament standard and applied it there, you'd say, okay, this would be the type of sin that would be covered by a type of reparations offering. What's difficult is how would you offer 20% more of Bob Fry who violated the body of God? You know, it just, you'd have to, the restitution part would be difficult, but the concept is there. Now let's talk about something that's a little bit more difficult, and that is, how do you confess a sin that you don't know that you committed? Or you don't know, how do you know that you committed a sin when you don't know that it was a sin, or that you did something that was a sin? In Leviticus 5:17 through 19, the scripture says, if a person sins and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though he does not know it, he is guilty and will be held responsible. He is to bring to the priest as a guilt offering a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him for all the wrong he has committed unintentionally, and he will be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He has been guilty of wrongdoing against the Lord. Well, it took me a little while to try to figure out what this unknown trespass could possibly be. And how would you realize, if it's unknown, how would you know that you committed a sin? Well, in the cultural environment in Israel, and we have trailings of that even today, we always talk about bad karma. People think that they are suffering because they did something wrong. They're, God is in some form punishing them or disciplining them because they did something wrong. Or people are not sure what they did wrong, but they carry guilt with them. Well, this type of offering was designed to deal with that situation where you felt guilt for something, but you couldn't put your hands on what you did wrong that you feel guilty about. You just know you did something wrong. Your conscience is bothering you. And the Israelites believed if your conscience was bothering you, it was God pricking your conscience to feel guilty. They also, if your bad things were happening to you and you didn't know why, your first thought would be, well, maybe I did something wrong and God is disciplining me or punishing me. And so what you would do is you'd go to the priest with a ram for a reparation offering, and you'd say to the priest, I feel guilty, but I don't know what I did, and I'd like to make this offering to set the record straight. Or um, I'm going, all these bad things are happening, and I don't know why, and I'd like to make a guilt offering or a reparation offering to to set things right with God. So they would make the offering, and then if their conscience was clear, then they said, okay, God was prompting my conscience to feel guilty. Or if the bad things went away, they said, yes, God was disciplining me and I took care of it. If bad things continue to happen and you feel guilty, you said, well, I made my offering, I made my peace with God. It's got to be just the way the world is. So it was a way of thinking that they dealt with this sin. Um, I can relate with sometimes feeling guilty without knowing exactly what I did wrong. Um, Sometimes somebody would be very angry at me and they're accusing, but they never tell me what I did wrong. And I'm asking, well, what did I do wrong? And I'm trying to go through my mind, and these type of things happen. And so this is the type of thing that this offering was designed to take care of. So if you feel guilt or you bad things are happening to you, it's going to break down your covenant relationship with God. And so these offerings were designed to restore that relationship and receive God's forgiveness so that you can approach God and you can boldly petition him. Now, sometimes these guilt offerings or these offerings were made when a person finds out after the fact what he did wrong. So you could still find out later. But in all of these type of offerings where you didn't know that you were doing wrong, but you felt guilt or your bad things were happening to you, or you found out after the fact what your wrong was, there's no requirement for restitution to be made. God is not going to require you to make restitution for something that is vague. And it's hard to go and value or determine what the restitution would be in this type of sin. So this is the only exception to the restitution requirement for reparation offerings. Now let's get into the second category, if you will, or the next category of uh, trespasses that would require an Israelite to make a reparation offering. And these are sins which defrauded God and others. In Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving his neighbor about something entrusted to him, or left in his care, or stolen, or if he cheats him, or if he finds lost property and lies about it, or he swears falsely, or if he commits any such sin people may do, when he thus sins and becomes guilty, he must return what he has stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to him, or the lost property he found, or whatever it was he swore falsely about. He must make restitution in full, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day he presents his guilt offering. And as a penalty, he must bring to the priest, that is, to the Lord, his guilt offering, a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord, and he will be forgiven for any of these things that he did that made him guilty. This is where trespasses against another person's property were considered act of unfaithfulness against God himself. Sinners who defrauded others frequently in the culture of the time, they professed their innocence by making an oath to God. I swear I didn't take it. I swear I don't know anything about that. It would be an oath, and they'd say, I swear upon the name of the Lord. And this type of oath taking again is something that God takes very seriously because his name is holy. And to put God to the test to demonstrate his righteous judgment by punishing you because you're lying or because you're making a false oath is something that God is dishonored by. So this is an act of unfaithfulness or breach of covenant relationship, and it requires the perpetrator to make an offering in reparation for his sin. The trespass sins of property belonging to the other include embezzlement or wrongful appropriation of property that is entrusted. You always have a person who may be a servant or an employee who might embezzle money from his employer, or you may be asked to hold property belonging to another and you spend it or appropriate for your own use. It also includes robbery, theft, cheating, or defrauding another person of his property. We have all of these schemes that are going on in the world today: cyber theft, cyber stealing somebody's name or likeness, stealing their credit. We have withholding or not delivering property to a person who's entitled to possess, own the property. The discovery of lost property, where you know who the owner is, but you fail to deliver it, never disclose that you found this property. These are the type of crimes where they're trespasses against the property interest of another person, but they're also an act of unfaithfulness to the Lord, which is magnified when somebody takes an oath to hide, to conceal, or lie about his violation of a property interest. In order to make the reparation offering, the trespasser was required to confess his sin before the Lord and acknowledge his wrongful act to the rightful owner of the property. Well, he had to return the item that he took from the rightful owner, or he embezzled, or the value plus 20%. And this restitution had to be made on the day that he offered the ram in a reparations offering. And so he would have to go to the owner. I took your property, I embezzled your property, or I found this property and never returned it to you. And here's the restitution plus 20%. And then he has to go and confess his sin when he brings the ram for the offering. I confess to that with this lamb that I committed a sin of trespass to my neighbor's property by stealing it. And then the ram is slaughtered. The blood spread around the altar. The ram, uh, the fatty parts are burned on the altar. The rest of the ram is eaten by the priest. And then the priest forgives his sin. And that forgiveness is a pronouncement of no longer being held responsible for that sin of trespass and being made whole to the neighbor that he defrauded, or to the priest that he defrauded, and forgiveness was for the whole community to accept. Now we're going to take a moment and talk about the parable of the unmerciful servant, because this is a New Testament parable that Jesus told his disciples about. It starts when Peter went to the Lord and asked the Lord a question: how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Now, under Jewish law, you only had to forgive your neighbor 3 times. But Peter, feeling good about himself as righteousness, said, Lord, I'm willing to forgive my neighbor 7 times. And the Lord said, Peter, you don't even understand how far you have to go. And he says, Jesus answers, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. For the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. 10,000 talents was about 20 years of income. There was no possibility whatsoever for the servant to ever repay his master for what he misused or stole or embezzled or whatever. But he begged for mercy from the master, and the master said, the servant master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii and grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay you back. In this case, the servant with time could pay it back because the 100 denarii was within reach for the servant to repay. The man had just been forgiven and not required to repay a debt he could never pay. And now he's punishing a servant who, given time, would be able to repay him. And he says, but instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't have you had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. He'd never be able to pay it back. "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." Now, we just talked about Old Testament forgiveness. You would make an offering of restitution and the sacrifice of a costly ram. You would confess and receive forgiveness from the priest on behalf of God and on behalf of the community. And there you could go forward. In this case, in the New Testament, we have some similar facts, but some different facts. The facts presented in the parable are the servant had misused or stolen his master's property. Isn't that the sin in the Old Testament for reparations? They misuse or misappropriate that which belongs to the Lord, his master. Now, 10,000 talents represent an amount which was impossible for the servant to ever repay. The servant pled with his master to grant him additional time before being punished. He wanted to make restitution. He wanted to make things right. But showing mercy, the master canceled the debt entirely. In the Old Testament, God used the reparation offering as a means of mercy, forgiveness for those that had committed the sin against God and God's property. Now, despite the mercy and forgiveness shown to him, the servant attempted to collect what was owed to him from his fellow servants. God gave mercy to him, but he didn't give mercy to his own servants. When one of his fellow servants begged for mercy, he refused to give it. Seeing this, the other servants of the master went to the master and told their master of what happened. The master called the unmerciful servant in, rebuked him, sent him to the jailers until he could repay the debt, which would never happen. What does this teach about God's mercy and forgiveness? God in his mercy is willing to forgive us for our trespasses and sins. He provided a means in the Old Testament, and Jesus displayed God as the master, willing to forgive a servant that misused or misappropriated the master's property. But God expects us to forgive others the same manner that he forgives us. God's forgiveness does not require us to make reparations or restitution. God cancels the debt entirely. He will cut, but the consequences are the same. If we are not merciful in forgiveness to people, and God has shown us mercy, then God is going to withhold his mercy, not his salvation, but his mercy, and he's going to allow us to suffer the consequences on earth. The servant that was unmerciful was put in jail and he was tortured, and he suffered the consequences of the crime he committed because he did not show mercy or forgiveness to other servants. And so it's not the salvation, the justification, God is there, but the consequences continue. Now, in the Old Testament, when you're forgiven by the priest, then the consequences, you're not borne by the wrongdoer in the community. It was treated as forgiveness of God is forgiveness of the community. God will visit his discipline and punishment on us if we don't forgive others in the same manner. Forgiveness is necessary to restore the covenant relationship. In order for a wrongdoer in Israelite times to restore his relationship so he could properly worship God and not have guilt and not be indebted to other people, he had to make this offering. We have to ask God for his mercy, and we have to trust that Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross will give us that mercy. If we do not forgive each other, then our covenant relationship with God can be restored. How can we as Christians ever grow in our closeness to Christ or walk in our love of Christ if we are not forgiving to people? And so God's saying that sanctification is truncated. by our failure to give forgiveness to other people. So they have in common is that through Christ or through these reparation offerings, God provides a mean to restore his covenant relationship to individuals who are unfaithful. The reparation offering required the person who misused property would set aside to and belong to God to confess and acknowledge what they'd done. Isn't that what we do when we lay our sin on the altar? The misuse of what belonged to the Lord required atonement in the form of a sacrifice of a ram as a substitute for the person who committed the trespass. Jesus is our sacrifice in atonement. When the reparation offering was complete, the trespasser was forgiven and the covenant relationship was restored. The purpose of the reparation offering was to maintain the covenant relationship and restore the trespasser, forgiving trespass. Reparation offering canceled the trespass and restored the trespasser. The forgiveness by the priest required the other members of the community to accept that forgiveness as well. Okay, so it doesn't fit on all fours to what was understood by the Israelite community as far as a trespass offering, but it really points to the perfection of forgiveness that the Lord offers us, a sinner, through the work of Jesus Christ's atonement. And it still requires us to acknowledge and confess in order for our relationship with God to be restored. So now we're going to get into the portion of this lesson talking about discussion questions and conclusions. I could have gone, but I shortened it to the trespass sins which we commit against what belongs to God and what belongs to others are considered by God as sins against himself. Unlike the reparation offerings where restitution was first made to the priest or to the person injured by the trespass, and then the atoning sacrifice was made to God in order to obtain forgiveness and restore the covenant relationship. When we turn to God for forgiveness, God in his mercy forgives our trespasses, and Jesus provided the atoning sacrifice on our behalf to restore the covenant relationship with us. In the New Testament, taught to leave our sacrifice at the altar until we make things right with those we have trespassed against. And then we can return to the altar where our worship, gifts, and petitions will be accepted. Okay, so that concludes the first area, division of Leviticus, where we talk about the offerings. Now we're going to go to next week, we're going to start the offerings and the actions of the priests. And so we're going to go back to some of these things, but now we're going to look at these things from the priest view. How does the priest accept an offering? What does the priest consume? How are the priests consecrated? We're going to leave the congregation of the Israelites. We're going to leave the individual members or the leaders, and now to focus on the priesthood. Look at the requirements that God imposed upon them.